thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. Thank you for joining me here in Wrocław. I'm really happy to be back. Last year was the first time that I arrived here for SQL Day Poland, and I'm really happy to be back. Today, I get to talk about Fabric Capacities, something that should be so simple, but apparently it is not. There's a lot of people that have confusions about this topic, and for me, it's one of the core topics to get right, because it is the very basis of everything we do within Fabric and Power BI. That said, I do want to thank the sponsors. I know how much it costs to order coffee for 800 people, to get food, to get the AV guys. I know how much money this costs. Without them, the ticket prices that you're paying would be a lot more expensive. So if you haven't spoken to them yet, please go do that. You can probably win some swag. You can probably win some prizes. I heartily recommend it. That said, my name is Benni Jagere, and I'm based out of Belgium. I am Belgian as well. Please don't tell me that I'm American, because I'm not. I'm Belgian. Yes, I do work for an American company. It's called Microsoft. Maybe you've heard of it. I'm not sure. We were a small company with like 300,000 people globally, but that's the company I work for. I also don't know all of my colleagues by name in the 300,000 company people. I don't, sorry. I work in a team that's called Fabric Cat. Apart from sending each other cat memes, we are the customer advisory team. What that means is that we're essentially the part of the product group that goes out and we actually talk to customers. We actually try to help them. We actually try to help them use Fabric better. We try to understand their challenges, the problems that they had, and then we go to have, well, very lively discussions with the PMs on why we think certain things would need to change to help our customers move forward. That said, I do help a user group out in Belgium organize events just like this. It's really fun. It gets people together. It gets them learning, laughing, networking, all of the important things in life. If you have questions afterwards, the essence is fairly simple. I always use the same alias. You can ping me there. I will not guarantee that I'll respond to you within the day. I tried that before and that didn't work out. That said as well, I am not a fan of pie charts, but luckily, I hope there will not be a single pie chart today in this session. I think. I had to think for a while. Now, let's talk about Fabric Capacities. Fabric Capacities, they are the very essence, the very core of Fabric, because they are the layer of compute. And in case you hadn't noticed, everything you do in cloud these days requires compute. So that is why these things are the cornerstone of everything we do. If you look at the beautiful architecture, and I'm not sure if I can actually see something, but who has not seen this diagram before? Has our marketing department failed, and have we not found a single lost human being to spam this with? Just checking. I'm talking about Fabric Capacities, the universal compute capacities. They are the single layer of compute that powers every single one of those blocks above, workloads. That slide is horrendously outdated. I need to fetch a new one because there's other workloads, things have been renamed, you've got new icons, etc. But it still shares the message that it's the thing that powers it all. Now, these capacities, they are a shared resource. We share them across workloads. Whether it's a warehouse, whether it's lakehouse, notebooks, they all share this same layer of compute. Universal compute, as it said. They are shared across projects, workspaces, or different projects. So that means that if they are using that same block of compute, well, they have to play along nicely. But they are also shared across users. So that means that if that project, if that warehouse is being consumed by multiple people, well, they are all using the same layer of compute, the same block of compute. And that is where it's really important because, well, potentially things can go wrong sometimes. And that's where realistically, about 50% of the conversations that I have with customers these days is about capacities, about helping them understand what's going on and what they could do about it. So yes, there are a lot of things that are happening with this space, but they are the building blocks of what we can do. They're the building blocks for growth, because essentially, without compute, you will not have a cloud resource. It allows us to scale up virtually, building upwards. The way that these Fabric Capacities, the sizes work, is essentially we always do ×2, which is great. F2, F4, excellent. 250 euros, 500 euros, excellent. F64, okay, well, F128, yeah. And then we get to the territory where it's F256 to F512, where it's all of a sudden a jump of 60,000 euros a month or something. So the scaling up, doubling the capacity size is easy to understand, but not always suited to what the customers need. Therefore, sometimes we actually have to scale out, scaling horizontally, using multiple capacities instead of one. A lot of the customers initially adopted the mother of all capacity strategy, where they just said, 1 mega capacity, let's just dump everything on it. But not in every case, that's actually the good thing to do. And then, well, we also have scale by region. It could very well be that the operations of your company, well, that you have a center here in Poland, but that there's also a center in Singapore, there's a center in Switzerland, there's a center in the US, and they are all very keen to have their own data close to them. Well, it is as easy as telling you if that capacity is created in the region of UK South, any data, any item that is using that will store the data physically within that region. There are some other things out there for metadata, etc., but the actual data is stored within that capacity region. So that's a very important concept to understand. Now, if we then talk about how do we get these, I'm specifically only talking about the Fabric capacities right now, because the Power BI premium capacities, well, they are there. There are a lot of customers that still have them for 3 years, but we've officially announced that we're moving towards only Fabric capacities. Now, you can buy these through Azure. Pay as you go, which essentially is for every second that you keep the capacity running, you will get billed. Well, every second after the first full minute. So if you run it for 59 seconds, you still get a minute, but a minute and one, you get a minute and one billed. Or the other option is reserved instance pricing, where you essentially say, I commit to running that capacity, I commit to running this amount of capacity units for a year, and then you get a discount. You get 41% discount. Now, the thing that is really important to understand with those reserved instance pricing is that they're not necessarily bound to the numbers that you see, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. You can get any number that you want, any number that makes sense to you. But that's not really the thing that I wanted to zoom in right now. The thing that I do want to zoom in is, well, this one right here. Because this is where I keep having, let's call it lively discussions with our team on why we don't make this more obvious. Because we talk about F2, F4, F8, but how we do our evaluation, how we determine whether your capacity is healthy or not, well, that all happens in those 30-second blocks. Every 30 seconds, we check, what are you using? Are you using too much? Are you using too low? Are you not using enough? That depends what we do with it. So the 30-second block is really important, and it's not obvious enough. So that's why I'm making this a bit more obvious. I'll get to the load evaluation part a bit later, but this is the one that I really wanted to call out. So if we talk about F64, that means that every second you have 64 capacity units at your disposal. What is a capacity unit? It is a magical unit of measure that we invented while we were blowing smoke out of our ass. It's a magical mixture of CPU usage, bandwidth, disk I/O, a couple of other things, essentially to abstract away some of those numbers. But it is the unit of compute, the same as you had DTUs with Azure SQL Database, the same way that Databricks has their compute units, the same way that you have compute units in practically every other cloud instance as well. But every second, you have 64 compute units. But every 30 seconds, we check, have you used lower than 1,920, or have you used more? That is the balance that we do for that F64 example. So that's the one that I really, really, really want you to understand on this one. All right. Now, the region part, I kind of spoiled it already, but the important thing there is please, please, please make sure that you understand that the data physically resides within that capacity. And it will stay that way unless a user asks to do something different. If a user asks to pull data out of Switzerland and they pull it into the US, then that's a user-initiated action. We didn't do it. The data is there unless a user asks to do so. And that can be pipelines, that can be different things, but that's the very important part right there. Now, if we talk about the core concept, who feels that they understand the concepts of bursting and smoothing? I'm blinded by the lights, but I also don't see a lot of hands. So that's good, that's why you're here. So these are what makes Fabric Capacities different from practically any other cloud vendor, cloud data platform that you see out there. It has benefits, but boy, if you don't understand it, you're gonna have a hard time. That's why this is a really important thing. So the concept of bursting and smoothing are the two new things that we introduced with Power BI Premium Gen 2, like 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. Those concepts, they transitioned over into Fabric, which meant that a lot of the new workloads like warehouses and lakehouses, etc., now all of a sudden also had to deal with this. The smoothing part essentially means that we smooth usage across a certain period of time. The execution still happens. You're allowed to execute that job as fast as humanly possible, but the usage, the billing part, that happens over those extended periods of time. It also means that, well, scheduling contention is less of a worry, because for practically all of the jobs that you run with Fabric, they are smooth across 24 hours. So whether you run that at 2 a.m. or 4 a.m. or 3 p.m., we couldn't care less. The usage that you're gonna see on the capacity is gonna be the exact same thing. Now, please don't forget that if you're scheduling 25 jobs to your SAP system, that SAP system also still has to be able to respond. So on our end, yes, but you also have a lot of different cogs in that chain that you need to take into account. So the job scheduling thing still is very important. And well, you are less, I'm not saying you're not, I'm saying you're less prone to spiky behavior from individual users. It still can happen. It's still a very frequent point of feedback that we get from customers, but you're less prone to this. The bursting part, well, that essentially means you get to execute it. There is no difference in speed whether you execute a notebook on an F2 capacity or an F1024 capacity. It all runs the same hardware, it all runs the exact same things. The only thing that is different is, well, your compute allowance, how much you are allowed to compute. But the bursting part, well, that basically says you get to borrow CUs from a future time and we execute your job. So that's done. Good and bad. Both downsides, both upsides. But it means that, well, you get to use a bit more, which is really good until the point where you start using too much. And that's the too much part that I'm gonna get to a bit further in the session that I think also is really important. Now, let's throw that into a few visual graphs. Without smoothing, essentially that means that you have workloads, you have different projects, a BI project, a DW project, whatever you want to call it. Whenever someone executes that job, executes a notebook or does a load into a DW, that would mean that you would see usage. You would see that, so for instance, the black DW Spark right here, well, that would execute closely up to 160 CUs. That would tip over that capacity for that period of time, which happens a few times on that graph. Is that a bad thing? No, not necessarily. If we smooth out that usage, well, we're actually not reaching those tops because we spread out the usage across 24 hours and we're not tipping over that point. Now, in general, I do think that it's a bit worrisome because you are consistently getting high up to the limit, and if you want to use Power BI with unpredictable usage, that could be an issue. But it's a lot less worrying than you're seeing on the left side. Now, as I said, it has upsides, but it also has downsides. Now, if we look at that bursting part, you execute a job. You execute a notebook, for instance. And that notebook gets to execute more than those 64 capacity unit seconds that it needs. It gets to use more. It just is executed. That's the bursting part. Whenever that job runs, it still says, yeah, sure, well, use a little bit more than you need, but then we're still able to do it. The second job is the same thing. Okay, well, execute this. But now, if we then talk about billing, if we talk about how we map that back to our capacity system is, well, we're going to chop it up into bits and pieces. We're going to chop it up into bits and pieces. And I actually should not have said notebooks because this is a Power BI query, because it's interactive usage. My bad, sorry, my bad. It's a Power BI usage. Someone's clicking on a Power BI query, and that means, well, that query is executed, they get their results, but then after that point in time, for the next 5 minutes, every 30 seconds, you're paying back a 1/10 of that consumption. The query is already done, it's purely the billing part. So bursting allows it to execute it, borrow units from the future, borrow compute from the future. Smoothing essentially spreads it out across those 5 minutes of time for interactive. And then if we talk about the batch jobs, the larger jobs, anything that runs in Fabric essentially, that is what we call a background operation. And that we smooth across 24 hours. So typically they use a lot more compute units. They're a lot more resource intensive because you are doing heavy operations, you're getting your fact tables ready. It makes a lot of sense. It should use more resources than the people actually querying it. But we run that job, you're allowed to burst, you're allowed to execute that, but then we start smoothing that out across 24 hours. That's the part there. Now, is everyone still with me? All right, good. Now, the part where, how do you actually keep track of this thing to see if it makes sense? Well, that is this thing called the Capacity Metrics app. I have opinions about the Metrics app. I think a lot of people have opinions about the Metrics app, but it is actually, once you get the hang of it, once you've caught onto a few things, it is actually rather useful to look at it. But there are slides in here that explain some of the things, but I prefer just diving in and I prefer just walking through this thing myself. Now, if I go ahead and look at I'm in my Power BI portal, or the Fabric portal, whatever you want to call it. Let's say that I've never installed that Metrics app before. I'm just quickly going to show you that it's crystal clear for everyone. I want to click on Apps. I want to click on Get Apps, and then that means that I can go ahead and look for Capacity Metrics app. I want the one Microsoft. There we go. I want to get that app, and then there's a few steps that you need to walk through to install it, but they're all properly documented. I'm not going to bore anything with this right now. What I want to do is I want to actually make sure that there are a few bits and pieces and a few gotchas that you probably should be aware of. Now, my resolution is horrible, so this is going to be fun, but essentially, whenever you enter that Metrics app, I'm going to need to do a lot of zooming here. There we go. Closely there. Ooh. All right. Yeah. Nice. So, whenever I look at the Metrics app, there's a few things that spring out here. This is just the default page, the one that we're looking at right now. But by default, I get a few things here that I want to talk about. By default, it's going to look at 14 days. That is the maximum amount of history that you get. I know a lot of people want more history, but there's some technical things that we're jumping through to be able to give you that. But right now, that's the 14 days that you get. Essentially, I use the table below, this one right here. I use that to make sure that I have an idea of who are the big hitters, who are consuming a lot of resources, with the combination of, well, are there a lot of users using this? In this case, it's not, because it's a test tenant of the CAP team itself. But in a customer environment, that would be really the thing that I go look at. But the thing that I've seen with a lot of people that they forget about is that you can actually select these optional columns. What these optional columns do is they can give you pretty useful information. For Power BI, I like to go look at the item size. In general, for every single unit, I like to go look at the overloaded minutes and sometimes just the performance delta to get a vague idea. But don't look too much into that. So essentially, it gives me an idea of, well, what's the workspace, what's the item name, how much CUs has it consumed, and how long has that taken. When I'm looking at this thing, well, if there's a heavy ratio of CU usage, like there is in the top right here, if there's a heavy usage of CUs versus duration, well, that means they're doing a lot of compute-intensive things. They're probably using a lot of DAX, they're probably using a lot of Power Query, which means there's a lot of resource-intensive things. For Power BI, I could easily tell that. With the new Fabric workloads, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Now, specifically for Power BI, the item size is one that is a frequent point of confusion. So I want to clarify that one right here. The value that you see right there, spoiler alert, is not the item size. It is not the item size. It is actually, for the 14 days that you're looking at this, what was the maximum memory that it used. So they should have called that the max memory used, I know, but there's things going on. But it means that in those 14 days, at its peak, it used 0.3 gigabytes, so 380 megabytes at the largest. What this helps me do is, well, if I'm looking at capacity sizes, it easily helps me identify if, for instance, if people are talking about scaling down a capacity and they have a F64 capacity, which means they have 25 gigabytes of memory for a single item, that helps me identify it easily. That's why I look at that thing. It's not the item size, it's the memory used. Key thing there. So I don't want to put too much time into that table below. Use that as a point to go look at, okay, well, who are the heavy hitters? Who's consuming a lot of capacity units? And then how do I track them down? My culprit is fairly obvious. It's the one on the top. It's called the load test, which is exactly what we do with that capacity. But it helps me explain a few concepts. Because the graph that I use most often is actually the one on the top right. Is actually the one right here. This graph right here tells me two things. It tells me, well, what is my background consumption and what is my interactive consumption. And the background consumption, if you recall, those are all those jobs. Essentially any Fabric item, with the exception of Fabric SQL with Fabric database. And then anything else is an interactive operation. That's the red part. So blue typically is very spread out, very even, unless things start to go wrong. And red is spiky behavior. Now, on its own, this graph looks, well, you would say that this capacity is in a lot of trouble. Because for entire periods, we're actually hitting over that limit. That's what it seems like now. Now, the thing is, this is a gotcha for the metrics app, is Power BI in general has a data point limit. If we surpass that data point limit, we start to do something which is referred to as sampling. We drop certain time points, and probably you'll get the right result afterwards. So what I'm trying to do here on this graph is for 14 days, look at every 30 seconds. Anyone that can do some math, 14 days, every 30 seconds, that's going to be a lot higher than 3,500. So it's doing that sampling part. It's trying to look at this thing. So if I go back, I should not walked away that far. If I go back to my metrics app, well, and I change the dates. There are two main ways of doing this. Most people just click on a date right here and do cross-filtering. I'm not that big fan of it. I essentially go into my filter pane, I switch it out to basic filtering, and then I want to go look at, let's do yesterday, the 12th. Now, this is going to put me down to a single day for every 30 seconds, and that fits well within that data point limit. Now, whenever that graph is done rendering, right about now, well, I should have also clicked, that would help. There we go. Whenever that graph is done rendering, it's going to give me a better overview of what happened yesterday. Now, essentially, well, around 3 p.m., this starts to go very spiky, and around midnight, that starts to drop. Now, I can exactly tell you what's happening right here. My colleague Sergey, who lives in Florida, that's when he starts working, and then afterwards, that's when he stops working. But it actually does mean to tell you that, okay, well, this looks bad. This looks pretty bad because we're consistently going over. Now, where this new concept comes in, called throttling, is a bit different from this. Because if you look at this, purely at this, it looks as if your capacity is not in a good shape. You're overusing it. And what would that potentially mean? With those premium capacities before, well, the instant you shot over the bar, someone would have to pay the price for it. With going over to Fabric Capacities, with going over to the new throttling mechanism, you get some leeway, you get some buffer. Now, it means that we do something which is called, we borrow future usage. And you have a budget of 10 minutes. 10 minutes of capacity usage. So 10 minutes of F64 if you have an F64, 10 minutes of F1028 if you have 1028, but that's what we borrow you, that's your buffer. If you're still within that buffer, nothing bad really happens. If you go over that buffer, then we start to force people to pay back the price. What does it mean to pay back the price? Then we go into another concept, I'll go into that one right after, that's called rejection. We start forcing people to have errors. Now, this purely shows me the operational overview. What is happening? Purely from a smoothing perspective, what's happening right here. And I could go into any of these time points, because otherwise I'm going to forget this. I could go into any of these time points. Either you right-click on this, you drill through, or you select one of them, you go into Explore, either works. That allows you to go look for a 30-second window. That 30-second window that I mentioned in the beginning. So every single 30 seconds we check, have you used more, have you used less? So for my P1 capacity, the F64 equivalent, I have 1,920 capacity units available. That is what I have available. Right near, on this particular one, well, I'm not over-consuming, but I forgot to clean up a lot of my filters. Give me a second. I was doing digging for Copilot. All right. Yep, now it should be good. All right, so purely from my part right here, my interactive operations, what does it show you is, well, who has executed the query on your semantic model? When did it start? When did it end? How long did it take? And how much CUs did it take? This is where those concepts start to come in, the smoothing concept, because we apply that smoothing for you. All right, and I swear that I can still use Zoom it. Now, that example right here, I mentioned that we use 5 minutes for interactive smoothing. So that query that Sergey ran, that ended at 9:32, well, 9:32 but close to 9:33, that consumed a total of 777 capacity unit seconds. But still, the thing that we bill you for at that point is the 77.75. It's that smoothing part that applies for you. For 5 minutes after that query has ended, 1/10 is being paid back. So for everything within this 30-second window, the smoothing part only applies. So roughly 4% of the capacity. My interactive usage is about 50%. But then I have to combine that with the background operations below as well. Now, the thing that I've seen with a lot of people where they are tripped up is, well, when does that smoothing actually start? And this is actually a really good example. Because, well, I'm looking at the example of 9:36. And I'm still seeing queries for 9:32. Now, we start smoothing when an operation has ended, when it's finished. Then we start the payback process. So if you have a notebook that runs for 24 hours, well, then only the day after we're going to see the usage. Now, the easiest way for you to have that visible in there is you, again, select those optional columns. You can select an operation ID. You can select smoothing start, smoothing end. That essentially is going to show you for all of these queries, when did we start the payback process and when will the payback process end for this? So this is something that not a lot of people are aware of when I've spoken to customers about this. And I forgot the operation ID only really makes sense if you use it on the background operations part. But the same thing happens for those background operations. You have jobs that are running, and why the heck are we seeing those? You have jobs that are running a day after. These jobs are running on Sunday, but I'm still seeing them the day after because we smooth across 24 hours. So while that event house used 135 event capacity unit seconds, in this particular slice, in this time point, there's not that much in there. Same thing applies here. You can select the operation ID, smoothing start, smoothing end. And why does the operation ID matter? Well, for instance, notebooks, warehouse, you get the actual query ID, and you get to go back and start looking over there what exactly they were doing. So it makes the troubleshooting part a bit more easy. But this is purely just, okay, what's happening right now? What are people doing? What happens if we go over the red? What happens if we start over-consuming? Yep, that's the throttling part that I really want to discuss with you. Throttling is something that you're going to see right here, and it's actually already happening. What that means is that, well, if you've consumed too much capacity, you've borrowed more than those 10 minutes of future capacity, well, we force payback. How do we do that? Well, we make your business users suffer. So you also feel the pain because they're going to call you. That's the way that we do it. But it means that, well, those queries, they're being forced to wait for 20 seconds. 20 seconds, then we execute the query. How long is 20 seconds for a business user? Eternity. Yes, +1 eternity. But it is a very long time. But it means that those 20 seconds, well, we use that to get back some other resources. Now, how can you actually tell if that's happening? Well, in the metrics app, you see throttling being applied. No, you cannot select who gets throttled. We determine it not really at random, but we determine with queries that are running right now, do we need to force some to wait, yes or no? So it could be the CIO that gets throttled, or it could be someone else that is not running a really important report, but there's no way to influence that behavior. Now, I wanted to look into the throttling part. There we go. I want to look into the throttling part because that's where stuff gets interesting. Throttling essentially tells you the state of your capacity. And the really important thing to note is the interactive delay threshold. The threshold is the dotted line right here. It means that we only start throttling when the spikes go over the dotted line. This does not mean that roughly 50% of the queries are being throttled. No, this shows you that you are 50% towards the way of being throttled. Not very common for people to understand, apparently. But if I go ahead and if I go look, if I set my date filter up again for yesterday on the 12th, well, I'm going to look at what exactly is happening. So it means that I go over a little bit. I go over a little bit, and there is some throttling that is happening. The thing is, it takes roughly 10 to 15 minutes before the throttling actually kicks in. Sergey kicks off his job at 3 p.m. But only like 3:15, that throttling starts to kick in. That's the buffer that we're using. The buffer we're using, the free usage we're giving you, that's what you're getting for free. But as soon as we then go over, well, someone is forced to wait for 20 seconds, we try to get back some resources, and another one gets to execute. But what happens if you still want to go beyond this? The throttling part, the interactive delay part, well, if you talk about future usage, the 10 minutes that I mentioned just before, if you kick that up a notch, and if you use up to 1 hour of future usage for the capacity, that's the throttling part. If you go over the 1 hour, if the capacity would be doing nothing else than paying us back 1 hour, then we start the next one, which is called interactive rejections. And that means your business user gets a big fat error. It says, the capacity has exceeded the maximum amount of available resources. Contact your capacity administrator for more details. Something along those lines. It means they get the error. we force queries, we force operations to error out. Interactive only, so it's just Power BI, or Fabric SQL DB these days as well. But let's say, well, you kick it up another notch, you go over that part. The next boundary that we have is 24 hours. So if for an entire day you would be doing nothing else than paying us back, that is when we declare a state of background rejection. Background rejection means jobs will not run. No warehouse, no notebooks, no semantic model refreshes, they will not run. Now, in Power BI use cases, I've had a lot of discussions with customers where they said, well, I don't care if my semantic model refresh still runs. I actually want them to still be able to query, to run their reports. Not something you can completely do right now, but we have some things that will help with this. But if I jump into those other tabs, the interactive rejection and the background rejection, I can show these to you really quickly too. It means that here, same thing, we have a threshold, which is the 100% mark. Any graph that you see there is the progress towards. So no, not 50% of the queries are being rejected. We're 50% towards seeing those rejections. So even with the throttling, even with the load testing that my colleague is doing, we're about 60% towards that rejection behavior. So nothing too much to worry about on that capacity, but it is good to help us demo these things because it is interesting to see. If I switched over to that other tab, if I switch over to the background rejections one, well, it should show you a similar result, but a lot less progress towards getting there. Come on, I know you can do it. All right, there we are. So 25% towards that progress. Now, so those concepts of throttling, they are kind of important to understand. Because if a user calls you and says, or if you yourself notice it, that, well, you get those delays, well, you're probably in that first phase. But if you get that error, the capacity has exceeded the maximum amount of available resources, well, that probably means something is going wrong. Something needs to be looked at. For me, myself, the typical part that I do is I jump into the latest slice of data that I have, which is 5 to 10 minutes. Officially, we still say 15 minutes. It's 5 minutes, 5-6 minutes. That's where we're at these days. That means you get to look at the data from about 5-6 minutes ago. It helps you to pinpoint, well, how healthy is my capacity? What do I need to do? Well, who are the big consumers? Is there still something that I can do? The key thing here to understand is that the metrics app itself, the telemetry data, that runs in direct query. So we run direct query towards our telemetry clusters, but everything you see for item names and user names and workspace names, etc., that's import mode. That runs on a single refresh per day. So every day at around midnight, that scheduled refresh runs. So if you have new items, new workspaces, etc., that were attached, that were created, you're not going to see them until you refresh. And you can essentially just say refresh yourself, so that's the thing. So for me, typically I click that refresh button, I start to go look for things, and then I can start pinpointing these things. But bursting, smoothing, throttling, I hope you're a bit more clear with these things right now. And there we go. So there are a lot of slides in there. Go through them if you want to yourself. But I just prefer doing it a bit more natural, a bit more fluently. The slides, I shared the QR code in the beginning of the session, by the way. You get those at the end as well. So you get the slides, no need to take photos. But yeah, so many slides. The question that I often get as well is, well, which capacity size do we need? Yes, that question. The reality is that even though we have the Fabric SKU estimator out there these days, well, it's still not an easy answer. It's still very dependent on how well you know what you're going to run. How much data do you have? How often do you want to run batch jobs? Are you going to use Lakehouse? Are you going to use warehouse? Data flows. So having an idea about what you're actually going to use really will determine those results. I did not put a link in there to the SKU estimator. If you Bing for Fabric SKU estimator, you'll probably find it pretty easily yourself. Now, I'm still a bit more traditional, let's call it. I still very much prefer to use the metrics app. Run a small POC, run a small representative test. You don't need to go all the way, you don't need to go to full length, but look at the metrics app and see what the usage is. Because that first graph actually tells you a lot that you need to know. It tells you how much are you using. And there are two ways of going at the planning exercise. There is plan for peak, and there's plan for average. I hesitate to tell people to say plan for peak, because then they're paying a lot and they're not using their capacity to the fullest. You're essentially burning money, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So I am typically the one that says, let's plan for average. All of you, probably, I think, maybe some of the admins turned it off, but you can get your hands on a Fabric trial capacity. Free for 90 days, and then you get to use this. It's a P1 equivalent. It allows you to do a lot of testing if you want to do that. Now, if you look at plan for peak, it is fairly simple. Look at the highest peak, go look there, and then the number that we have is, well, 750 capacity unit seconds. That's the peak usage that we have right there. We can map that, we can map that to the table that we had. Now, in the example right here, it says we had 750 as the peak. Now we map that towards the F32 with 960, so that we can accommodate that peak. As I said, myself, I'm a bit more on the conservative side. If that were the exercise I would be doing, I would go for F16. Because that single peak will probably make it through with the bursting smoothing that you've seen before, but the throttling aspects that you've seen as well. At worst, with that peak, you're going to see some delays. If that peak is supposed to be happening every week on a Monday, that might be a different story, but that's essentially the thing right there. Now, I do have to pick it up a notch, because there's a key concept that I want to talk about as well. It's pausing capacities. F capacities are an Azure resource, so you can pause and resume them like any other Azure resource. Works just fine. But there are a few things. What happens if you pause that capacity? Well, within 10 minutes of you clicking that pause button, jobs will stop. So it takes about 10 minutes for a warehouse to do proper transaction consistency, backups, etc., to shut down. But within 10 minutes, that's turned down. Well, new requests will not be allowed to start. I get it. But especially if that is still in the works of turning down, it will not accept these new things. But the third bullet, smooth usage will be reconciled, that is the thing that I've seen too many people forget about. What it means is we look at the usage that you have. And if you would look at the metrics app, that would tell you, well, for the next 24 hours, you would be paying us back this. Now, if you pause that capacity, the outstanding balance is not magically lost. We're generous, we're not stupid. It means that, well, we do a reconciliation event. We essentially flip that back, forget as if bursting never happened, and any outstanding usage that you still have, well, that gets billed at that point in time. So I've seen customers use this as a capacity protection mechanism, which is fine. It protects your capacity. It does not protect your credit card. But because you effectively see all that unsmooth usage, that usage that not been paid yet, you see that on the Azure billing. And if you then start the capacity again, you start going higher and higher and higher and higher again, you pause it again, well, it's going to be a very expensive operation. So pausing, yes, that is definitely worthwhile. But you want to have a look at, does it actually make sense to pause this? If it's a heavily used capacity, quite often it is not a good strategy. Please, please, please check this, because I've seen nasty surprises with this. So If we do look at the other one, well, instead of pausing, potentially resize. If your capacity is under stress, well, you can scale up. You can double up the size, you can double up the bill, but the capacity is healthy, but we also pay back that balance that you still owe us at a faster rate because you have more available balance that is not being used, more that can be used to pay us back. But if you want to scale down, if you want to scale back in the weekends, in the evenings, you can do that. You can scale down as well. The thing that you want to avoid is that if, for instance, on that F64 capacity, you would be using 35 capacity units on average, and you scale back to F32, well, you're going to be running an overage. Potentially, that capacity is going to rack up, throttling interactive delays, rejections, etc. They could start happening. So resizing, I do think, often is a very valid strategy instead of pausing. And I'm not saying that because then you would still be running the capacity. I'm saying that because I've seen people be very surprised with pausing the capacity. So check that, please. If you pause the capacity, check the impact it would have. Now, yeah, we've had this. All right, so when that capacity is paused, it's the bursting and smoothing graph. We take all the usage that's not been done yet, that gets added to the bill, and then we move on. You can also see this on the metrics app where all of a sudden all the usage disappears until the point in time where you start it up again, which was here, then they paused it again, but the screenshot I need to update. If you want to look at has the capacity been paused, has the capacity been resumed, there's a system events tab in that metrics app that you can also look at. Now, I don't want to talk about this, I want to talk about these things a bit more. What are some of the things that I often do with some of the customers? What are the strategies that I talk about? How do you set up the capacities? How you deal with these capacities? The reality is that quite often, well, you have capacity usage and it's kicking you in the nuts. It is over-consuming, people are struggling with this. What are the options that I have? I have no idea why I hit this, not hit this, because we've all covered this. All right, now what are the strategies that I discuss with my customers? I always try for option one. They don't always bite. In the long-term vision, optimizing, reducing the capacity units, checking the refresh schedule, checking the amount of data that gets loaded in, is for me always option one to discuss. Because long-term, that's going to reduce the most amount of CU consumption. If it doesn't work, well, we can still try some other things, but quite often the pain is there and you need to do something quickly. And for a lot of the customers, it means paying external consultants or having time from their internal people to work on these things. So it's not always the easy thing. But optimizing to make it fit within the boundaries of your capacity consumption. Well, second option would be scale up, which is the easy one. You scale up and then you're good for another week or two. But then what happens if the capacity is too small again? Do you then just go blindly scaling up again? Where I mentioned before, well, in the beginning, F2, F4, that's all fine. But once you start talking about 128 to 512, 512 to 1000, 128 to 256, 256 to 512, those are big numbers that we're talking about. So scaling up is not always the one that I do prefer. For short-term relief, yes, absolutely. Most often, scale out is the consistent way, is the viable way of doing this for the future. It means separating out workloads, separating out development and tests into a different workspace, into a different capacity. Self-service could have their own capacities, for instance. If you have mission-critical reporting, make sure that that's on a separate capacity. There are pros and cons, because probably you will have more smaller-sized capacities that have more buffer, but it does give you the peace of mind that they're not interfering with each other. That's the thing. But if we talk about some of the, what can you do right now? Well, you have isolation strategy. You have a workspace that has really crucial reports that really needs to work. You could move that out to a different capacity. whoops, no, you could move that out to a different capacity. Make sure that that has the workloads to run. The other way around is if you have a workspace where people are doing horrible things, they're not optimizing, they're using a lot of Analyze in Excel, you want to move those out to a new capacity, that's fine. But the damage they've already done does not move with them. Just because you move a workspace, all of the historical usage doesn't move with them. So it does still impact the original capacity. The isolate part is, well, make sure that the workspaces that are there are good. Typically, I do also recommend we do something which is referred to as a tryout capacity. Spin up a F28, F64, whatever. F28, that doesn't even exist. F16, yes. F16, let's try it out. Does it work, yes or no? If it works, move it onto the workspace. If it doesn't, then move it back, tell them to optimize. It is time consuming from the admin perspective, but it does help staying on top of things. The other way around is the timeout capacity. This is my favorite one. It's putting the kids in the naughty corner. You have a small F2 capacity that you perpetually keep throttled. You overrun that consistently. And if kids are being naughty, you put them on that capacity. Yes. It's more of a way of saying, this is the pain you inflict on others. Do better. Yes. People skills might be needed for this one. Just saying. But it could be worth putting them onto a too small capacity, for instance, not necessarily the over-throttled one to bully them, but a capacity that is not nearly high enough for them to force them to optimize a bit. Look, the workload that you're running here should easily fit into F64, but you're running F128K equivalent. I'm putting it on an F64, deal with it. As I said, people skills might be necessary, but I have seen some good results with these things. Now, rescue capacity, move something out to a new capacity. Not really the thing I wanted to talk about right now, but yes. Can you go to the microphone, please?
How about the autoscale?
Autoscale is dead.
Not in premium.
No, premium capacity autoscales. Power BI premium capacity still has autoscale. What autoscale does is, oh, you've hit the 100% boundary, I will add some capacity for a full day. The full day part is what trips people up. For a hefty price as well. We don't have that for Fabric Capacities. We don't have that. It is also not arriving, period. The alternative that we're doing is, you may have seen the serverless billing for Spark announcement, where essentially we say, it's 3 or 4 weeks ago, we said for Spark workloads, so notebooks, etc., instead of being added to your capacity, what you see in the metrics app, the blue lines, the blue consumption, we are instead instantly going to send it to your Azure bill. It's not going to be used in the whole bursting smoothing part. The billing part, we're just going to send to Azure. So you instantly pay for what you're using. So that is auto-scale-ish kind of protection by putting that outside of the capacity. But I purposefully didn't want to cover that in depth right now because it sets me back for another 15 minutes, which I don't have. But if you're interested in that part, serverless billing for Spark is something good to look into. Like full-on auto-scale, the way you're expecting it, that's not arriving. We are working on something else. Hopefully we can announce that in Vienna in September. But yeah, that's the thing. I'm gonna move 2 more slides and then we can open up for 5 minutes of questions. Yeah, that's what I figured. Now, the thing that I do want to say is, officially I need to tell you that it's not supported. You cannot, you can extract data from the metrics app to build your own solutions and dependencies, etc. You can do that, but when we change the mechanism, not if, when, that's on you. The semantic model underneath the metrics app is also not really well designed. We will not provide, why are you? No, you're right. We will not give you any documentation. We will not give you any measure formulas, etc. You're on your own for that one. If you really want to do it, there are options. The one that I'm waiting for, passionately waiting for, it's on the public roadmap. It's called real-time hub capacity events. So that you have a stream from real-time hub within Fabric that gives you capacity usage. Essentially an event stream that tells you, well, all of these queries have executed, start, end, consumed this amount of resources. An event stream, you can plug that anywhere you want to, you can store that for how long you want to, that's on you. The second part is capacity state stream, where you can pull that and say every 10 seconds I want to check, well, every 30 seconds I want to check how healthy is my capacity. 80%, 70%, 90%, whatever, and that's where we can start building dependencies for DIY autoscale. If you're over-consuming, scale up. If the usage drops again, scale down. So we're finally getting it in customer hands. It's in private preview. I want to get that out to customers as soon as we can because it's going to enable a lot of these use cases. That said, there's a lot of things in there. The last one before we go to questions is, well, Analyze in Excel is the world's most popular BI feature. Yes, yes. People want to use Excel, and I get them. If you're used to that, that's what they want to use. Pure simply put the difference between Analyze in Excel, between selecting the rows, the measures, and the filter, versus filtering, measuring, and then adding the rows is quite significant. It's the exact same thing. Whoops, it's the exact same thing. Roughly about 12,000. If we do it the other way around, if we filter, measure, and then add the rows, well, we get to roughly 2,000, let's say 2,800, 3,000. So a lot less. So purely educating on please make sure that you use Analyze in Excel right can actually pay off. That said, slides are over there, QR code. The other one around is github.com/Benni-Jagere/presentations. If you know what year it is, if you know the date, if you know where you are, then you will find the slides. And I will now gladly open up for questions. We had 2 questions from the, okay, yeah, let's go with these.
I think one of the questions you answered partially, but I will start with the first one. So the first one is, are there some capacity tier specific features that are available for high tier ones, while not available in the lower tier ones? For instance, at least some time ago, that was the case for Copilot.
Copilot we dropped. Copilot is now available for all SKUs. The big difference is free consumption of Power BI. Do you need a Power BI Pro license to use a report or to read a report? P1 or F64, we give you that for free. If the semantic model is hosted in a capacity-backed workspace, you can use it with a free license. Any capacity lower than that, you need a Pro or a premium per user subscription. That right now is the only big difference for lower than F64 or P1 equivalent.
Thanks. And the second one, I think you answered partially, but can you recommend good solution for autoscaling?
Well, officially I cannot, but the link that is in the deck might be a good option to do it right now. Any other questions in the room? Yes? Go up to the microphone, please.
Yeah, I actually had a question to what was just talked about, but expand on it a little bit. So the difference with the pro licenses, because I like your strategies, but that's the one blocker for them, I think, because we cannot go down from F64 because we need this license bit. And yeah, considering that this change has just happened for Copilot, do you think that something might be happening with the licenses as well?
So, no, because then Office would declare war on us. No, I don't see that happening. No. Any other question? Yes, over there.
Hello. Our team has 5 environments, and we work mostly on serverless approach and looking at data factory and other data integrations.
Yep.
How would you suggest we approach the scalability, also trying to reduce the cost of non-production in terms of Fabric evaluation?
There's a right now answer and there's a when we have the capacity events. Right now, it's going to be periodic, as in you know when to scale up, scale down. Development and test environments should be fairly straightforward. I would not go as far as pausing them. Look at the usage. Does it make sense to pause those capacities, yes or no? But in most cases, you can actually scale those development environments back to a lower capacity size and then pay back, but at a lower usage. Purely on the serverless aspect, I briefly mentioned that we have serverless billing for Spark. That's essentially that. While I cannot make any official statements, it is not very likely that Spark will be the only one. Is that cryptic enough for you?
No, I think the biggest worry we had with 4 non-production environments and the lowest tier, that was really the biggest concern at this stage.
Scale back. Scale back. Well, if you don't need the items, if you don't need to use anything of that, and it's fine to pause them. Pausing them is fine, but typically I recommend scaling them down to lower capacities. But if we're talking about non-production development, there should not be a whole lot of usage on there. So if the metrics app tells you that it's fine to pause them.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Good. I think we're at time. If you have more questions, I think I'm also back here for the AMA at 6:15. If not, I'm going to grab my stuff, go outside, and then you can find me as well for questions over there. Thank you so much.